I want to spend a little bit of time over the next few Tuesday nights sort of making our way toward the 250th, July 4th. And this week is going to be a nice little launching pad coming off of the rededication 250, the prayer event over this last weekend. We took part in that. As we kind of set up this evening, I want to make sure everybody who's watching online knows as well. The last 20 minutes or so, we're gonna watch a clip from a movie. If you've not seen the movie A Great Awakening, you're definitely gonna want to watch that. We are over the next 4 weeks gonna grab some clips from that and watch it. We'll be able to watch it here. We just aren't able to stream it online. So if you're with us online, when we shut off the live streaming, it's not because we don't like you. It's because we just, that's just what we have to do. So we'll get to that at the end. But before we get there, this actually makes a really good place for us to begin to talk about what Rededicate 250 was about, what was behind it, and kind of why it was put together, certainly why we engaged in it. It's got a whole website devoted to it, a National Jubilee of Prayer, Praise, and Thanksgiving. On the website, encouraging people to get involved, be part of the prayer, and other events that are being held throughout the year and so forth. They note these three pillars that they have about why they did it. The miracles that made us, a reflection on God's providence throughout 250 years, honoring the faith that inspired America's founders and has carried us forward in every generation since. I'm hopeful over the next few weeks to talk about some of these kinds of things, not just the quotes and things that maybe we're half familiar with, but there is so much more that I just get a kick out of. And so I think it's going to be a lot of fun sort of walking through that. Pillar number 2, the miracle is still in our midst, personal testimony of God's healing in our lives and our land. And pillar number 3, a new birth of faith and freedom, a collective expression of gratitude for 250 years of freedom, and a unified movement of rededication, asking for God's blessing, guidance, and grace for the next 250. So much of this is a matter of making sure we take time to recognize what we've been given. What started there at the beginning, these individuals, these founders, men and women, the things they wrote, the things they believed, what motivated them. The more you walk through that period of time in American history, things that are just, I think, obviously a matter of God's providence, in His sovereignty, even miraculous events that get us through that period of time, into an independent nation and so much else that followed. It's not, I think, unreasonable to use the word miracle to describe a lot of what happened 250 years ago. So have a chance to go through a lot of that. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. And the importance of not losing it. I think part of what we're going to discover is that a lot of what's happened over the last 100 years or so has been a papering over of a lot of what happened 250 years ago. So we go back there and we read that and we read them and we listen to them and we make sense of what they did and why they did it. I think this is going to be a kick. But we wanted to pray last Sunday for the nation, to be a part of this with other believers who were praying as well, repenting of sin and asking God to bless this nation and to rededicate it. We will see how often this nation has been dedicated in covenant relationship between the people who landed here and founded this nation, creating a covenant relationship between them and God and the nation that was built here. We're actually going to read that language a lot as we kind of go through these next few weeks and see this happen. I told Heather as I was putting this together, these first couple of things are going to feel a little bit like a what in the world, because we had this great big event. You may have seen some of the live stream on Sunday. It was like 10 hours long. There are all kinds of things that happened there on the National Mall. A lot of churches and other places did their own things like we did last Sunday to pray for it. But of course, you've got a lot of reaction to that. So Rededicate 250 was put on by both public funds, federal funds, as well as private funds. It was done on the National Mall, and it was a deliberate rededication of this nation to the God of the Bible. So you can just begin to imagine the kind of people who got a little bit frustrated by that and the kinds of things that they said. But it gives us, I think, a really good launching pad into some of the things that we're going to talk about. So a large opinion article inside of USA Today here on the left, Rededicate 250, focus on evangelical Christians is un-American. More than half of Americans support the separation of church and state, yet Trump is spending your tax dollars on Rededicate 250 to push one version of religion as the only government-favored faith. Rededicate 250 as the all-day event on the National Mall is called. It was like 10 and a half hours long. Will platform almost exclusively those kinds of preachers in a way that brazenly and intentionally violates the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. You gotta love stuff like that. This is part of a larger attempt to undo the decrees of men we call our nation's founding fathers, to undo the decrees that they wrote into our first laws mandating a separation between church and state, which is not there. We'll talk about that here in just a second, right? But how common is this? This is USA Today. This is not some leftist, wacko, Marxist rag. This is intended to be a mainstream news publication. And this guy in 2 paragraphs has written things that are just factually false, as well as just, obviously his interpretation of things. Here's a panel discussion on MSNBC where the gal on the right is hosting. If you watch the clip, it's the guy on the far left who answers, and when he answers this prompt, he knows the prompt is dumb, but he still dances around it, trying to not disagree with the prompt. But we see this a lot more, right? So the gal on the right says, what about this passage from Mike Johnson? He also spoke at Rededicate 250, declaring that our rights do not derive from government, they come from our Creator. Is this him putting God above the Declaration of Independence? And he sort of, makes his way through and sort of weaves his way back around to the whole, we can't establish a religion, separation of church and state kind of stuff. The dominant narrative in American history for 100 years, you track this stuff down and you read people about it, the dominant narrative has been our founders put together a secular constitution, a secular declaration of independence, and they wrote into our laws that we would be a secular nation. So that's the dominant narrative that we've had for the last 100 years or so. Even those individuals who write a lot about American history now and who will write from the primary sources, and they will quote these individuals talking about providence and sovereignty and God and even using the name of Jesus Christ, and their conclusion will be, but they were deists. They really don't mean that as in the God of the Bible, it's just the language that they used. So there's a lot of that. If you just listen to relatively modern versions of early American history, this is the kind of stuff that you end up with, including, alleged news hosts and journalists who haven't even read maybe the first few sentences of the Declaration of Independence. It was a senator, I forget his name, a few months ago, who in a Senate hearing complained that, well, if Americans believe that their rights come from God, how does that make us any different from Iran, right? So he was arguing that rights come from government and not from God. So this is very common in our age right now. So the New York Times, one of the articles that they posted, the Trump administration pushes narrative of Christian founding at rally. They, of course, intend to say, well, that's ridiculous. This is Trumpism. This is MAGA stuff. This is Christian nationalism. This is very, very dangerous. And then you've got this think tank, the Center for Inquiry. And as soon as you hear the Center for Inquiry or Free Thinkers Foundation or something like that, you immediately know that there's very little inquiry and free thinking going on. They slam the Rededicate 250 event, calls for renewed commitment to Jefferson's wall of separation between church and state. On Sunday, the National Mall played host to Rededicate 250, an event partly funded by millions in public dollars, which organizers designed to prepare for the nation's 250th birthday with scripture, testimony, prayer, and rededication of our country to one nation under God. The Center for Inquiry condemned the day-long event as an egregious misuse of public dollars and another example of a dangerous recent trend of Trump administration attempts to falsely rewrite history and cast America as a, quote, Christian nation. America's founders purposely created a nation with a decidedly secular government after taking a lesson from centuries of bloody religious conflicts that racked Europe. Why would we choose to go back to those dark ages when majority religions imposed their dogmas through law or the sword? It's un-American. One of the profound geniuses of what happened 250 years ago was the needle that they threaded with being both a Christian nation in the sense of it's being founded on biblical and Christian principles, and the notion of religious liberty, which confuses these people. It is an amazing piece of genius that they managed 250 years ago. And we'll get a chance to sort of play with some of that, I think, over the next few weeks and spend some time with that. The separation of church and state. So the vast majority of us are sharp enough to know that's not the First Amendment. That's not written anywhere in the Constitution or anywhere in our laws. It comes from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to a group of people who were the Danbury Baptist Association. It's a very short letter. And in that letter, he quotes the first phrase of the First Amendment, that the government will establish no laws regarding, the establishment of the prohibition of religion. The very next sentence, he says, and I do hope that we will be able to maintain the wall of separation we've erected between the church and state. It's a very short letter. The last sentence is its own paragraph, and in the last sentence, Thomas Jefferson, in the language of 1802, he says this, and I will be praying with you for the health of our nation. He says, I will reciprocate your prayers on behalf of our nation. That's how he finishes this particular letter. On top of that, and I love these little details, because very few people talk about these kinds of details. That letter was written on January 1st, 1802. Thomas Jefferson was president in 1802. January 1st, 1802 was a Friday. On January 3rd, 1802, Thomas Jefferson attended church in the Capitol building. Did you know that? He attended church in the Capitol building. He is one of the early presidents who mandated that there be a Christian chaplain in the Capitol building performing services every Sunday. All right, so what does Jefferson mean by this? Well, we'll, talk about First Amendment stuff and these kinds of things later on, but clearly not what these folks are saying. This language of a secular constitution and secular laws and secular nation where blah, blah, it's just not historical. It's just not what actually took place, right? So it's good for us to pay attention to some of these things and the way they actually occurred. All right, so this is a great piece of the story. Alexis de Tocqueville is a Frenchman who is sent to America. He and another man were sent to America to basically figure out how on earth is this American experiment going? How does it work? And so he wrote this big 2-volume piece on democracy in America that has since become kind of a touchstone for, what's going on with the character of the American people. So much of it has to do with the intricate, almost unconscious connection between public and civic life and public and religious life. A lot of what he writes back about has to do with those two connections. That it was just normal for Americans in the 1830s to connect their religious life, their Protestant, by and large, religious life, and their civic life as well. So, in 1831, he's invited to Albany, New York, to be a part of or to observe the July 4th parade that takes place in Albany, New York. So here's a retelling of what happens there. The procession of the parade, the July 4th parade, ended at the Methodist Church on the corner of North Pearl and Orange Streets. That Beaumont, who was the guy who was traveling with de Tocqueville, that Beaumont noted was so characteristic of America where nothing is done without the sanction of religion. Yet, to Tocqueville's surprise, the place of honor in the church was not for religious leaders or even state officials, but was reserved for those old veterans. Beaumont recalled how at one point great pomp surrounds the presentation of an old bullet-ridden American flag that survived the War of Independence. So you can imagine this connection between the War of Independence, whatever veterans you have left. You've had the War of 1812 since. You've got a lot of veterans there in Albany, New York. It's happening at a church where a minister is going to get up and talk for a few minutes and pray. What he's surprised by is that these people just considered this entirely normal, right? So one can only imagine the fascination. Tocqueville finished the story. The public sat in rows facing the podium. A preacher mounted it and recited a prayer calling upon heaven to bless America. The assembly responded with amen, whereupon a young man who had meanwhile joined the preacher read the Declaration of Independence, as is customary. It is truly an impressive spectacle. People sat in plunged silence until they heard the eloquent words of Congress recounting England's injustices and tyranny. At that, a murmur of indignation and anger ran through the audience. So they still feel it, right? Have you ever been to a melodrama? You know, the bad guy shows up and everyone goes, boo, right? The hero shows up, yay. So they read the indignations with, and everybody's getting angry. Yeah, that's what England did, right? It's great. At that, a murmur of indignation and anger ran through the audience. When Congress pled the righteousness of its cause and expressed the noble resolve to free America or die fighting, it seemed that an electric current was making hearts vibrate. In the recitation of the well-kept promises of independence, in this return of an entire people to memories of its national birth, in this uniting of the present generation with one whose exalted passions it shared for a moment, in all this there was something deeply felt and truly great. They had no problems putting those things together 55 years after 1776, right? We've got young people, we've got younger generations, we have the older veterans, we've got this bullet-ridden flag that they're, excited that they have there in Albany, New York. And this Frenchman shows up and he's just amazed at what he sees. And he writes back, he and his friend write back, this is just customary in America. And yet we have this disposition right now that we've got this wall of separation, that the last thing this should be is customary. The connection of our religious beliefs as well as the things that we believe to be true about our founding and everything that's involved with it, right? This was not the case in the past. So I want to go even further back and talk for a couple of minutes about the Mayflower Compact itself. Of the major documents that helped to create the form and shape of our nation theologically and its civic personality and so forth, there are a handful of these. And this has got to be the earliest one that is significant, that produces the kind of character that turns into what we see in 1776. But the Mayflower Compact, those who had come over, it had been an incredibly difficult journey. Only one of the two ships that had planned on coming over made it. So it was going to be the Mayflower and the Speedwell, but the Speedwell in England kept springing leaks. A lot of people thought it was being sabotaged because these separatists were terrible people. So it was only the Mayflower that made it over. And we know some of that story after that first winter. 50% of their group died by the time they got to spring. But because there was so much trouble on the Mayflower, and they've hit what they intended to be Virginia, but ends up being Cape Cod. They hit in November of 1620. It's getting cold. The people on the Mayflower are restless. So this group of Christian men and women, what they did is they wrote this compact amongst themselves about the form of government that they would put together to get themselves through the winter and to start this colony. And what they did is they had grabbed a few significant pieces of the Hebrew Republic in the Old Testament, and they stuck those things into this compact. And the compact itself, again, is actually quite short, but it's significant. It's full of some theological language and concepts. They signed their names to it. And so here's a piece of that compact. Having undertaken, for the glory of God, an advancement of the Christian faith, in honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue thereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, offices from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. You got to love these sentences. A long time ago, right? By the time you get to the end, you're going, no, wait a second, where did we start? What was going on with these sentences? But it's great stuff. So they are covenanting with each other, and they are telling us that they did this for the glory of God and for the furtherance of the Christian faith is the language that they use. They're mutually pledging in the presence of God one another. They're covenanting together for their preservation, for the good of the colony. These are how we are going to enact laws, develop laws, constitutions. We're going to put them together. A passage of scripture that they draw from comes from Exodus chapter 18. In Exodus chapter 18, Moses is being encouraged by his father-in-law about how to handle the government of the people. There's way too many of them for him to personally deal with. So here's what you do. You set up leaders over this many, and this many, and it kind of climbs up the ladder and so forth. So from Exodus chapter 18, it's verse 21 is this particular verse. Moreover, look for able men from all the people, men who fear God, who are trustworthy and hate a bribe, and place such men over the people as chiefs of thousands, of hundreds, fifties, and tens. So that is part of what they do here is they grab that kind of model, those kinds of people, and they say, this is what we're going to do. And in fact, they say, we're going to set up an election cycle from time to time. What they ended up doing was setting up an election cycle every single year. So they would elect their governor, they would elect whatever leaders they had year after year after year after year. All based on the word of God and men who met these biblical standards and so forth. So you go all the way back to the very beginning of this particular colony, a very significant colony in our history, and it's all covenanted with God. It's based on the word of God and a group of people seeking, of course, their religious freedom. So we move ahead 10 years to 1630, and we've got this preacher, this pastor by the name of John Winthrop. And he becomes another significant figure in these early colonies. So in 1630, they arrive on a ship called the Atwell. Was that right? No, the Arabella was the name of that ship that they arrived on in 1630. And he gave this sermon. So this in 1630, it's the first significant arrival of what we would call Puritans. And on the Mayflower, you had people who were separatists. They were separating from the Anglican Church. The Puritans were trying to purify and reform. So there are some differences there. But the Puritans are showing up, especially with John Winthrop in 1630. So he gives this sermon, he publishes this sermon called A Model of Christian Charity. And it also becomes a foundational document for the kind of culture that they're putting together. This is going to be a very specifically Puritan group of people. We're doing this for the cause of God. The churches is going to be at the center of this. The Word of God's going to be at the center of this. So they're setting up all kinds of order and structure politically as well as morally and theologically. When people typically reference this sermon, it is sometimes called the City Set on a Hill sermon. So the last couple of paragraphs of this sermon contain that phrase, a city on a hill. So Winthrop grabs some language from Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus is talking about you light a candle, you don't put it under a pot, you open it so people can see it. A city that is set on a hill is not easily hidden. They viewed themselves in these kinds of terms, that we are here again for the glory of God. We are here again for the furtherance of the Christian faith, and we're creating a Christian colony and group of people. So when you read this, and you get to these last couple of paragraphs, you hear again this deep and intentional connection between what they're doing as a civic body and who they are theologically and as people who belong to Jesus Christ. So beginning with the bold here at the top, for we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. This is very Moses language in Deuteronomy, that if we disobey God, that we're going to be a byword to his name. We shall open the mouths of enemies to speak evil of the ways of God and all professors for God's sake. We shall shame the faces of many of God's worthy servants and cause their prayers to be turned into curses upon us till we be consumed out of the good land whither we are going. Again, very Old Testament, right? We're going to obey God and God's going to bless the land. But if we disobey God, others will have a reason to despise our God because of our behavior, and we won't stay in the land. We won't remain in the land. This is very promised land language. And to shut down this discourse with the exhortation of Moses, I should start closing my sermons with that phrase. And to shut down this sermon now, right? This discourse with the exhortation of Moses, that faithful servant of the Lord, in his last farewell to Israel, Deuteronomy 30, beloved, there is now set before us life and death, good and evil. In that we are commanded this day to love the Lord our God and to love one another, to walk in his ways and to keep his commandments and his ordinance and his laws and the articles of our covenant with him, that we may live and be multiplied, and that the Lord our God may bless us in the land whither we go to possess it. But if our hearts shall turn away, so that we will not obey, but shall be seduced and worship other gods, our pleasure and profits, and serve them, it is propounded unto us this day, we shall surely perish out of the good land, whither we pass over this vast sea to possess it. Therefore, let us choose life, that we and our seed may live, by obeying his voice and cleaving to him, for he is our life and prosperity. This is how they saw it. This is how the Massachusetts Bay Colony got created. This is how it got started. This was the personality of the people who got this started and why they did it. So you keep kind of tracking John Winthrop, this group of people, and kind of what it turns into in Massachusetts. They made plenty of mistakes. So Puritans and Reformed types do this. They start griping with each other immediately. You get 3 Reformed types in a room, you've got 7 opinions on things, and all of them are heretical. That's just what happens with this group of people. But Puritans, this is what they're doing, so they do this. So there's plenty of that. They're just human beings, right? But there are other things as well. I think the year is 1641. If it's not 1641, it's very close to 1641. That colony made slavery illegal. 1641. So don't imagine it had to wait until 1865 or the 13th Amendment, right? All of it gets wrapped up then, so to speak. But early on, there's a story in their colonial record of a slave ship that landed near one of their colonies. The guy got off the boat to ask, is anybody here interested in any of the slaves that we have on the boat? The penalty for slavery in the colony was death. So they grabbed him, and he, didn't know anything whatsoever. So they let him go, basically promising to send the slaves back and never come back to this colony. That's how serious these people were about these kinds of things. Even the things that, we're often told that, well, if it's such a Christian nation, why didn't we solve some of these issues until later on? It's a huge, huge, incredible story, but realize what's in the hearts and minds of these Christians very early on. However, that changed and got mixed later on. Understand that's what's in the hearts and minds of our forefathers. All right, so John Winthrop, we're going to talk about 3 names tonight just to make sure we are just as confused as possible. John Winthrop, John Witherspoon, and George Whitefield. So, all right, just clear as day. John Winthrop, 1630. John Witherspoon. All right, so John Witherspoon is one of the lesser-known founders. So there's a large group of individuals who fit into this category of the founders of the American Republic. Now, the ones that we know best, sort of to make my point about the last 100 years, has tried to emphasize a secular founding as much as possible. When you ask most people who are the top 2 or 3 founders, 2 of those names are going to be Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. Now, why is that? One of those reasons is it's much easier to peg those 2 guys as deists, and we'll talk about that later on, whether or not that's fully and completely accurate, as opposed to what we would call Orthodox, Protestant, even to use the word evangelical Christian. So we know those 2 names, but we tend not to know some of the other names who are just as influential, if not more influential than guys like those 2. John Winthrop, I told you, it was going to get confusing. John Witherspoon is one of those guys. In fact, he is one of the intellectual giants behind what happens with the Declaration of Independence in the Congress. You trace him down. We're going to get a chance to talk about him a little bit more when we dive into some of the details of the Declaration of Independence. But John Witherspoon is fascinating. The Reverend Dr. John Witherspoon was a preacher in Scotland. And as is the case with a lot of preachers in Scotland, you end up in jail from time to time during this period of time. Apparently during something called the Highlander Uprising, he was thrown into jail for a while in Scotland. But he was then asked to make his way over to the colonies to help get started and be president of the College of New Jersey, which turns into Princeton University. So in 1768, he comes over to assume the presidency of what is now Princeton. He is one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. He was elected to the Continental Congress. According to one record I read, he was on over 100 different subcommittees in the Continental Congress, doing all these kinds of things. He also was, not in a general sense, but in a very specific theological and philosophical sense, he was a mentor to James Madison. Now, one of the reasons that is significant is that James Madison is typically understood as one of the primary authors of the Constitution itself. Now, there are obviously other people involved in that whole story, but James Madison, a lot of his ideas in the Federalist Papers, the Bill of Rights, come through James Madison. Well, you learn a little bit more of the story. It's coming through John Witherspoon. So much so that after James Madison graduated from Princeton, he went back for a full year to study just with John Witherspoon in Hebrew and philosophy. So this is the kind of person John Witherspoon is. He's part of the Enlightenment in Scotland. He brings those things as well as his theology to the U.S., and he becomes a mentor, a philosophical and theological mentor to a ton of individuals involved in the founding. So he was a mentor to many others, including a U.S. president, 1 vice president, 10 cabinet members, 21 senators, 39 congressmen, 12 governors, 3 Supreme Court justices, and 1 U.S. attorney general. So according to a couple of records, he has often been called the most influential professor in American history. And he was a pastor. He was a pastor in Scotland who came over to run the presidency and teach at Princeton, right? So we're not grabbing the most secular of all the Scots to come over and run our school. We're not grabbing people who philosophically now are atheists to come and run our school. We're grabbing people who theologically and philosophically are Christians as you and I would understand them, right? So this is part of John Witherspoon's story. So John Witherspoon, as a pastor, I'm sorry, Meg, I've lost something here. And there we go. Yes. So as a pastor, he publishes a sermon in May of 1776 called The Dominion of Providence Over the Passions of Men. You can go online, you can read it. I mean, if you can handle, again, the sentences that are 17 pages long, it's great stuff. But he's a pastor talking about these civic issues, and he's talking about liberty, and he's talking about natural rights, and it all to him is a matter of this is what we believe because of this book, so this is important for us to actually act upon. So it's fascinating. He's not the only one who does this, but this particular sermon, John Witherspoon, in May of 1776, here are a couple of excerpts from the sermon. From what has been said upon this subject, you may see what ground there is to give praise to God for his favors already bestowed on us. Respecting the public cause, it would be a criminal inattention not to observe the singular interposition of providence hitherto in behalf of the American colonies. It would be ridiculous to look at what has happened already and to think God does not exist and God is disinterested. God is actually involved. We see his hand in his providence. We have to understand that he is involved. So part of this sermon is trying to do 2 things: encouraging people to sign a declaration and to actually enter into its own national discourse, and at the same time, to control our passions so that we may glorify God. It's a fascinating line that he's trying to draw inside of this sermon. So another piece of the sermon says this: while we give praise to God, the supreme disposer of all events, for his interposition in our behalf, let us guard against the dangerous error of trusting in or boasting of an arm of flesh. I could earnestly wish that while our arms are crowned with success, we might content ourselves with a modest description of it to the power of the highest. We've done our part, but we have to remember this is God who is doing this. It has given me great uneasiness to read some ostentatious, vaunting expressions in our newspapers, though happily I think much restrained of late. I'm upset that there are some people saying that God's not involved, but we're going to temper that. This is not our power, this is the power. Isn't that interesting? May of 1776, July 4th of 1776, right? So this is a couple of months ahead of time. He's talking about how important it is for us to recognize God is doing this. God is doing this. God is doing this. And we can't take the credit for this. We're working and we're striving, but God is doing this. And we got another little excerpt here. If your cause is just, you may look with confidence to the Lord and entreat him to plead it as his own. That is a fascinating thing for a guy in his position to say in May of 1776. That if we believe that what we are doing is just in the eyes of God, not just, just in some sort of flexible sense, human sense, but he's talking in the eyes of God, what is objectively right and true, we can call on God as the one who will defend our cause. You are all my witnesses that this is the first time of my introducing any political subject into the pulpit. At this season, however, it is not only lawful, but necessary, and I willingly embrace the opportunity of declaring my opinion without any hesitation that the cause in which America is now in arms is the cause of justice, of liberty, and of human nature. Part of what we're going to see as we unpack some of this is when he uses that vocabulary at the end of this. Again, this is very specific, this is loaded vocabulary. This is justice, as in God's kind of objective and true justice for the human cause. Liberty is something that God has given the human being in very specific ways. And so we're doing this under God's sense of liberty. And then of human nature. That is a theologically loaded concept for him and for us, because this is his notion of human nature. This is where it comes from, right? So we're watching this unfold in their words, that none of them, hopefully we'll see this on at least some level, none of them would have believed that they were creating a secular nation. All of them on some level would have believed in at least the truth of the basic foundations of this and the necessity of the moral lives created by this. Even if some of them, like Jefferson and Franklin, were on one end of that set of beliefs, and others like John Jay and John Adams were on another side of that spectrum, they were all in that spectrum. Does that make sense? So even Thomas Jefferson is going to finish the letter by saying, and I reciprocate your prayers for the benefit of our nation. I'm going to be praying with you as well. He goes to church in the Capitol building, right? So this notion that they're creating a secular world and constitution is utterly foreign to every single one of them. All right. We're going to watch a short little video. If you get into this stuff, I'd encourage you to look at these. So the White House, and I think this is produced between the White House and PragerU, but what they've done is they've taken the lives of, these are PragerU, these aren't the Hillsdale videos, but they've taken the lives of these founders, and now I think there's at least a couple dozen of these kinds of videos, and they give you just a little snapshot of their lives and kind of their involvement in the founding in 2, 3, 4 minutes worth. And so you can just kind of see the form and shape of this. I've enjoyed these, and these are out there if you want to watch these and pass these along. Let's go ahead and watch that video, Megan.
My name is John Witherspoon. I was born in Scotland, a minister by calling, an educator by trade, never expecting to become a revolutionary. I came to America to lead a college. Back then, it was known as the College of New Jersey. You know it today as Princeton University. I crossed the sea to shape minds, yet found myself helping to shape a nation. At the First Continental Congress, when some said independence was premature, I rose and spoke out. The country is not only ripe for the measure, but in danger of rotting for the want of it. I sacrificed much. The British destroyed my home and my college. Those were material things and could be rebuilt, but I could never replace my dear son, James. In the Battle of Germantown in 1777, he made the ultimate sacrifice. For my son and my adopted country, I did not waver. Liberty must be built not only on strength, but on principle, on conscience, and on courage. Let those who inherit this nation never forget, freedom is a gift, but it is also a test.
So there's a bunch of those, and they're an absolute kick to watch, I think. Very easy to watch. So that's John Witherspoon. So these are a couple of important theological bits of the founding. The next one is incredibly significant for us, and this is going to be George Whitefield. So when we watch clips from the movie A Great Awakening, it's going to be this relationship between Ben Franklin and George Whitefield. But George Whitefield, you should at least know a little bit about this individual. He came up in Oxford at the same time as John and Charles Wesley. And so those two guys, and we know John Wesley as one of the founders of the Methodist movement, the evangelizing he did in England and in the U.S., George Whitefield was very much the same kind of character. So George Whitefield was absolutely amazing. He is a significant part of what is called the First Great Awakening in the 1730s, the 1760s in the U.S. Jonathan Edwards is another one of the preachers in the U.S. who is a part of that. The Great Awakening did some significant things to the moral character of the nation, so much so that a lot of the people who we call the founders in the 1770s and so on and so forth will not just reference George Whitefield specifically, but they will reference what happened as a result that made the Declaration of Independence, the Revolution, possible. So there are records from the early founders that will tell us that what happened as a result of the Great Awakening is actually what made the Revolution possible. So George Whitefield is a huge piece of this. Preached for 34 years in England and America. He's got this fascinating story. Preaching from behind a pulpit, this is a very controlled thing in the Church of England, and he sort of breaks out from that. He's preaching out in the fields. This is a brand new thing. He's going out to coal mines and out on the farms, and he's preaching, and people end up hearing that he's coming, and they show up, and they'll show up in droves. Thousands of people. It's not uncommon for him to speak to at least 10,000 people at a time, long before you had karaoke machines and portable speakers and all that kind of good stuff. It's fascinating. So in those 34 years, it's estimated that he preached about 18,000 sermons. And when he's on horseback in the U.S., he's preaching 3 or 4 times a day, and he is galloping from location to location to location. This is how he fits in this many sermons. He's traveling around as if he is, and this is not from his perspective, but it is as if you have got the most popular celebrity in the world is moving from town to town to town to town. So people hear that he is showing up, they'll gather by the thousands, and they will go and they will find him. It is estimated that about 80% of all Americans heard him preach at one point or another, which is astounding. The number of places he went and the number of people who showed up. He maybe preached to about 10 million people then in the colonies at that time. He developed this really curious relationship with Benjamin Franklin, and that's what this movie, A Great Awakening, is about, and it's worth watching. From what I understand, they really handle that relationship well, both Whitefield and Franklin, their perspectives, their relationship, and so on and so forth. There is this tremendous story, and it shows up inside of the movie. Whitefield shows up. He shows up in Philadelphia Benjamin Franklin is there. He has heard the story that he'll speak to 10, 20, 30,000 people at a time. Of course, it's utterly unbelievable. So he's there for one of the sermons, and so Ben Franklin does the kind of thing that Ben Franklin does. He sort of makes his way around a couple of the streets, the number of people who are there, and he's doing his measurements and his calculations, and he realizes, sure enough, there are thousands upon thousands of people who are hearing him speak. So he proved to himself that Whitefield is speaking to this many people on a regular basis, right? So you've got this incredible movement taking place, Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, so much so that when people write about this, Paul Johnson, who's an historian, writes on a lot of American historical stuff. He says it was the proto-revolutionary event, the formative moment in American history preceding the political drive for independence and making it possible. So the moral and theological change that occurred at the Great Awakening, these people say that's what made the revolution itself possible. John Adams writes, the revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the mind and hearts of the people and change in their religious sentiments of their duties and obligations. It was done before it got started, so to speak. So we've read in a couple of other contexts, and we'll get plenty of this over the next few weeks, how often these individuals would write things like, this kind of government is fit for a virtuous people and no other kind, is fit for a religious people and no other kind can make this work. So when they write things like that about the American Republic, this is not just, a piece of philosophy that they all got from one particular teacher at Princeton and so they all believed it. This is not just theoretical. They've watched it happen in their lifetimes. They've watched the character of their cities and their landscape change as the Great Awakening sweeps through the American colonies and the virtue and character of the American people change. The notion of human nature and liberty and virtue and the glory of God, all of this begins to change enough to build a group of people that to them, it's not just theoretical, we need religious and virtuous people. They were watching it happen. So much so that John Adams says it laid the groundwork for everything that we did when we started writing these documents. The revolution itself actually took place. So I think it is fair to say that the Great Awakening was necessary for all of these things to actually happen. It sort of brings us full circle back to where we began. Something like Rededicate 250, an event in which an emphasis, I should say, in which a lot of Christians are thinking, well, let's pray for this nation again. Let's work for the renewal and rededication of this nation, is a hearkening back to the kinds of things that took place even before the revolution occurred, right? You've got this Great Awakening. That's what makes this possible. So it was necessary, and it is necessary. So when we talk about these things, we're talking about theological realities, and we're talking about churches, and we're talking about Christians. We're talking about others who take these principles and turn them into reality for us. So we're going to read a lot of this, and I think a lot of things are going to be hopefully a lot of fun to learn and spend some time with, including pieces of this movie called The Great Awakening. I was really pleased with how this was done. So this is what we're going to do now. We're going to have to turn off the live stream, but we're going to watch the first about 17 and a half minutes of this movie. And so this is our little bit of setup for the beginning of this movie, and we'll keep kind of making our way through this movie as it weaves through the rest of this story.